that a family having a meal together, as you said, once, twice, 3 times a week, with no cell phones and talking to each other, is probably one of the most significant things that we could do in terms of a conclusion of this course tonight. Give us one thing, okay, from all of this. A family that will put down all their stuff. You've even seen that ad on television, probably, where everybody's into their screen, iPad, the phone, and so forth, and the mother comes along, she's got the master control. Whoop, 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 whoop. But, you know, it's got to be, we're going to the dinner table, there's a basket in the kitchen. Put your phones there. You're going to bed, put your phone there. And get them to buy into it. You have to deal with your own kids differently than you deal with the youth group because you're not the parent of the youth group kids. Yeah. Yes, thank you.
Can you define the difference between a youth worker and a youth leader and how those terms, some use them interchangeably, some are different?
Oh, okay, there's two things. Thank you for that. There's two things, and now this is just my thing. If it will help you, it will help you. But if we're working with all the youth workers of Boston, we're dealing with. Do you understand this? If we had a convention, and we should have just really great night, we have and so forth. I know. But if we called of any city, if you call all those that are working with young people together, you will be amazed at how many people come if there's food. Amazed at how many people come, and a good speaker. And so when we think about Boston, there's sort of 3 types. There's youth ministers who are Christians working in a Christian setting, okay? And then there are youth workers who are not working in a Christian setting, street workers and others who are working for an agency, who are Christians but working in a secular context where they don't overtly share the gospel. I personally can. And then there are secular Buddhists and good guys and wonderful women and so forth, youth workers that are just secular youth workers. So I use that. And now, in terms of thinking of the degree of expertise, this is another thing. A youth worker would come along and be a volunteer, say. Most of us started off that way. A volunteer youth worker who's coming in to work in the church youth group, but just on a very volunteer basis and sort of starting off. Then that person begins to develop skills and expertise. And when they begin to have the kind of leadership in the group where they have to go to some meetings and report and work on a budget and plan a year's calendar, that's a youth leader. The youth worker could come along and say, hey, I don't like meetings. Don't get me involved in the budget. I don't want a committee meeting. I just love kids. I want to spend all my time with the kids. Well, they're golden, right? They're golden. They just love kids, and that's what they're going to contribute to. You need some of those. And then the youth leader is a person that has given up 30% of youth ministry time to take on these other responsibilities to organize and manage. And then a youth director, particularly in a paraparochial organization, would be someone that still should keep his or her feet going with kids, but maybe only 15, maybe only 10%, and is working training leaders and is running the whole, and fundraising and doing some real common stuff. So is that a little bit helpful?
Yes.
Yes.
What about for youth pastor?
Well, a youth pastor would be a youth minister.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
I have an unrelated question. I know we've been talking a lot about technology, but when you started the lecture, you mentioned that 2 of the key really values of youth in this generation are justice and fairness. I want to know what is...
I'm equating those two.
Yeah.
Fairness and love.
Okay. And so what are some of the research that, not necessarily focusing on technology, but the values and the changing of the, kind of what students, the value system that they have. Is there any research that you know of that's really promoting that? I know a big one that we've talked about a lot in just kind of thinking-wise is postmodernism, where it's kind of, no lack of absolute truth, really a desire to kind of fit in with everyone's belief system. And so is there any kind of, why is it fairness and justice and love, like you said? Where
Okay,
did you
that's,
come up with
that's
that?
very, very pertinent for all of us. That's right on target as to where we are right now too in the overall presentation. There is a sociologist that I highly respect who actually went to Gordon College and then got his PhD, ended up teaching sociology and majored in sociology of religion. And he took all his research skills and all. His name was Christian Smith. And he, while he was still at North Carolina, he's now at Notre Dame, but while he was still at North Carolina, he had some of us in youth ministry come down and brainstorm and talk with him about what he wanted to do. He got incredible funding for the only research, extensive research of all youth, not just Christians, all youth in America, their religious views, including Muslims and Jews and others. And as I say, this is incredible funding, and they did an extensive survey with a tremendous, very scientific sample of young people, but very, very large. And they came out with what you can find on Google as the National Report of Youth and Religion. And then that report got written up in 3 books because it became beautifully a longitudinal study. Now, a longitudinal study is one that not only goes out and sees teenagers, but follows them through their 20s and maybe 30s, and you get this incredible thing. And by the way, Young Life and all the organizations I've been involved in have seemingly resisted longitudinal studies of the long-term results of kids that accept Christ at camp or in their clubs. And their reason they give is money. But I knew Merton, a psychologist who founded Search Institute, which is a very important research on youth and so forth organization. And I talked with him one night, and we were lamenting the fact that we couldn't get $5,000, say, to do some kind of a longitudinal study that would begin there. Anyway, that study came out, and there's 3 books, but if you go to Amazon and put Christian Smith in, and religious study and so forth, you will get 3 books. Do you remember the names, Virginia? One of the latter books is Lost Again or something like that. And but anyway, to get to your point, this study found 2 very, very important things. And now they were dealing with Gen X and the early millennials. And what they found was that young people across denominations and even religions.
Souls in transition and soul searching.
Soul searching was the first one, then souls in transition, and then there's a final one. Great, thank you very, very much. But this is an answer to your question, but for all of you, where are we going to look for information on our kids, the National Study of Youth and Religion? And it came up with this conclusion that the real, that there's a difference between the espoused faith and the real lived faith in teenagers. Tends to be, but this is shrinking. And that teenagers in general across church, from fundamentalists to evangelicals to more liberal kids and others, had a belief in a God who was not up there looking at everything they did, whether they cheated or masturbated or, God isn't interested in those kind of things. But God is interested in me as a person. And God will hear me if I'm really in trouble. And I pray, He really does hear. So God is like a grandparent. The parents have to discipline, the grandparents can spoil. So this was a grandfatherly, Santa Claus-like God who was, and they termed, Christian Smith and his colleagues termed this faith position as moral therapeutic deism. Moral, we're supposed to be nice to each other. That's what God wants. No matter who you are, what you believe, we're supposed to be nice to each other. Therapeutic, If you're really in trouble, he's the counselor to go to. Deism, God has gotten it all going, but he's not interested in all the little stuff that churches are picking on and Pharisees talk about. So that was one thing. And then the second answer to your big question, I think, is that the Barna Group has not only does their look at the whole country, adults, their values and so forth, how they're holding religion and so forth, from a Christian interest perspective. And so the Barna Group has put out its 217, which I didn't bring it, and the 218. But also in 218, they put out this Gen Z, which is what I want to look at just a minute now. And I think, see here if we'll answer some of your questions. Anything else to add to that? But isn't this important?
Yes.
Okay, now we want to hear about from the Christian perspective. And so this is what they have. And this is the book. Gen Z, here's the subtitle, it's good, important, you would have seen that. The culture, beliefs, and motivations shaping the next generation. That starts to. And then, is Gen Z prepared to follow Jesus in a post-everything world? Isn't that great? Because we've been realizing we're living in a post-Christian world, a post-church world. And it's getting to be postmodern, post-everything. And so that's how they're living, and they've learned to be tolerant in that. So that's a resource, right? And you can find the Barna Group and some of its stuff on the internet. Okay, so going into that book, there's a preface and introduction by Kinnaman, the person that wrote Unchristian, and what the world thinks of us, particularly conservative Christians. And here's I think the chapters. See, we can't get into all this tonight, I knew, so I just put this down, and I see if this gets to, it's looking at young people today in Gen Z, and it's looking at the world according to Gen Z. In other words, how are they working out their identities? Their ethnic identities, their gender, sex identities. I hope you know that we've got to deal with that. We've got to deal with that. And then who I am, and what matters most. This gets into their values, the chapter on the values. It's all laid out there for you. And then faith, truth, and church. What are their beliefs? And then making Gen Z disciples, hope for their and our future, which deals with how they're relating as a generation to faith, parents, and institutions. And then a number of appendices. So I think that's where you'll get deeper of what. Now here's some Barna quotes that may, see I can't go, you don't want to go through all the diagrams and charts and all, it would be too much for one night, but here's some quotes that I think will give you a sense of the direction of the book. Our culture is changing fast and teenagers are confused. Well, we've said that. It's trite. But then when only 34% of Gen Z, Christians and non-Christians altogether, can agree that lying is morally wrong, that's a big problem, Barna says. So you see, these people are taking opinions from a Christian perspective, which the secularists do take opinions, but it's from more of a general humanistic perspective. And then they go on to say, social media keeps us superficially engaged and overwhelmed by data, opinions, and information. So we've talked about that tonight, haven't we? And you've done in your buzz groups, that's come up. The fact that we just have too much to process. And that's why this is sort of an exhausting night. And this is why I feel really humbled. Is this of any value to you? Because even though I'm trying to be superficial, it's so much to go through. Social media is keeping us superficially engaged, and that's so important. Superficial connections, superficial knowledge. The typical internet user will only stay 7 seconds on any site. So we have a little center, it used to be Center for Youth Studies, now Culture and Youth Studies, CYS, Culture and Youth Studies. And all kinds of information, like in the book, or on that, on all kinds of topics. But it's sadly, right now, I don't know where to take it. It's just hanging there. It's not growing. And so I'm praying about that. Anyway, it was an attempt to take issues. But it was underused because people would have to take 10 or 15 minutes to read about mass incarceration or a summary of one of these books. And people don't have the focus. And this is what we're working with kids. They don't have ability to focus. The cell phone, the computer's been shrinking their attention span. And that's a serious issue. And this is not downing the technology, but it should be used in a discipline. Christ must be the Lord of the cell phone. And for your kids, he isn't. Jesus, even your fervent kids, does not ask Jesus to become the Lord and Master of this dark screen. And overwhelmed by data, opinions, information, and Gen Z is now the test case for the long-term effects on identity. Social media is completely reinventing what it means to come of age as a teenager. Social media is completely reinventing what it means to come of age as a teenager. This is the principal task of a teenager, to determine their identity and to move from being a child to an adult. That's their natural, universally through history. They were meant to do this. But we have taken this transition and we have artificially, high school mandatory education, we have artificially extended the adolescent period. So everything that would take place in the 20s is now postponed to the 30s. And the kids in junior high are more hip than high schoolers were some time ago. And the sexual thing and so forth goes back. So I know a lot of this is negative, but it's not damning the culture itself per se or the technology. That's a lot for a teenager to navigate. So, do any of you have youth groups or touch with youth and you haven't discussed Never Again? I was with a high school teacher working for Young Life last night, and he's a history teacher, and he's doing right now a unit on the Constitution and so forth. And he had not discussed Never Again with the Second Amendment right there. And you know what this is showing us is an amazing thing, that what adults have not been able to do, maybe the kids can. Maybe. We don't know that. Maybe the kids can. And incidentally, this flies against one of the prime findings that we've gone over from Gene Tidy, which we've got to deal with. Kids don't want to grow up. Kids are pushing off adulthood. And now all of a sudden kids are saying, if you can't do it, parents, politicians, president, we're going to make a change here. There's no reason for assault weapons. And so whatever side we're on this, and we should talk about it, we really should. Christians should have an idea about why the mortality from guns is so high in this country when compared to other countries who have as many guns or have much less guns. We've got to talk about that for the sake of kids, for Christ's sake. We've got to talk about that. Urgency and frustration, the Never Again movement gathers momentum. Does this movement challenge some of the research that we've discussed tonight? Yes, it challenges it. It can be an exception that may prove the rule, but whatever it is, we've got to look at it. And should Kuhn churches and youth groups be addressing never again? Would you be disappointed if you ended this course? Or you walked out of here tonight and you got the news about Somerville high school students in the greater Boston area mobilizing themselves and walking out in resistance, knowing that they might have to suffer penalties? Should your kids be talking about this? Should they do something about this? Or should we just say a prayer for the 17 who died? And the hundreds who are traumatized? And expect that it's going to happen again? Or should we go Wild West and arm the teachers? And should responsible people take their weapons into bars and into public events? We've got to talk about this. We may disagree, but we've got to talk about it and pray, and then to do something about it. Any comments on that? Hey, why don't we go into the bus groups for a few minutes and talk about that?
We have one over there.
Oh, yeah, please, first.
Dean Borgman, I had the privilege of listening to Dr. King's daughter speak in Rhode Island, where I minister. She was speaking at PC, and she was addressing more of the racial tension in our country. This event hadn't happened just yet. But one of the things that she said that stood out to me was the fact that this generation of activists, how it's not intergenerational. And so because it isn't, they're not really making connections with those that are older than them, that have been a part of movements that have changed the direction of our country, the laws and policies that weren't in place at the time. And she said that a lot of people end up burning out as young people, fighting against these issues because they don't have good strategy, and they're not looking for the smaller breakthroughs on their way to the major breakthrough. And she really talked a lot about justice in terms of her father's philosophy, and how most people, when they quote Dr. King, they think about civil rights as the only issue that he was fighting for, when in actuality he was about justice. And injustice anywhere, was injustice everywhere to him. Literally, he had a global perspective. And so she really challenged the young people to connect and continue to have conversations, but also look at what can I change now that will give this generation a win, so that it will motivate them to continue to fight. And I think when you were talking about Never Again, I just thought about how it can't just be teens feeling alone in this movement. It can't just be that they're out there trying to change laws without people in key positions who are adults partnering with them to see this through. So that was my thought.
Well, that's a good point. Now, the point is that none of you are teenagers. Are you with them? And would you be willing to have your youth group write a letter to the leaders of Never Again in Parkland High School and say, we're not there, but we're with you, we're for you. And then get you and your fellow leaders and your pastor to write a letter to the adults of that school and to say, we're sorry for what you've gone through. And we want to know that we're with you and the kids, your students. And we want to see it keep going. And why wouldn't we do that?
Yeah. And take it to our politicians and all of
Yeah,
the above. Yeah.
which is going on, which is going on. And those kids from the beginning had their parents who were going with them and were demonstrating with them too. But the point is really, really well taken. No, it's a very, very definite possibility that Black Lives Matter and Me Too and Never Again can die out in another year. And
This is a large undertaking she made the comment that her father could have taken on some of the major issues that were happening at that time,
Uh-huh.
but he knew that, Dr. King knew that it would take years to see a victory in that. But he knew, you know what, I can change this bus situation. And so he was very strategic in, you know, how that happened. And I thought that that was such a great point, you know, as we're moving towards seeing change in these, you know, bigger realms that might take years, but what can we do now, you know, that will help in that fight that we can see a win now.
And what do you think we can do now?
That's the question that I've been mulling over and praying over, to be honest. I don't know
Well, I
the
think
answer.
that's a good discussion for the buzz groups, that we should just take a little bit of time to say, if I was teaching a class, Biblical Global Justice at Hamilton, and I had a class with at least this many people in it. And it was a big amphitheater, so it's more exaggerated amphitheater. And over here was an African-American, very well-dressed and very articulate, a young man that decried gun violence in the neighborhood. When all of a sudden, a white MDiv student, straight A student, who happened to be, I found out later, a veteran from the Gulf War, just yelled out. He had never spoken in class. He yelled out, "I've got an AK-15 or whatever it is, and I go out in the backyard every afternoon when I'm feeling like it. I've got cinder bricks, and I go, Brah!" And I'm standing there in class. And we've got to be able to move into those situations and say, brother, I'm glad you don't live in Massachusetts. I guess you live in New Hampshire, right? And then say, tell us a little bit more. And what do you think are the qualifications for somebody that owns an assault weapon? So can we talk about this? And can you understand at all the difference of you as a white rural veteran might have from an urban person of color who's been exposed to the trauma of communal post-traumatic stress difficulties and is coming from there? And is there any way the Christian church can take this perspective and your perspective and bring them together? And that's what we have to be about, it seems to me. But we ended our racial reconciliation class here last fall and in Hamilton with the need for forgiveness and lament. And I think there has not been Christians, when they come up against an impossible injustice or evil situation that we can't change, we tend to give it up and pray for personal strength, personal, and so forth. But the biblical characters of Moses and Daniel and Ezra were leaders who prayed for sins that they had not committed and lamented the sins, not the private sins of people, but the systemic corporate sins of the nation, of God's people. And so my colleague teaching went down to work in Boston with some secular people, I guess. Or no, this was with a black pastor in Boston. And he said that we had come to a conclusion that there needs to be a call for the church to lament the racial situation and animosity in the country. And the pastor's response was, what good is lament without action? And so somehow, in your buzz groups, we're faced today with this particular problem of shooting that's traumatizing a generation, to some extent, circles. And what do you think you, as youth leaders, to the extent where your church should do about that? Okay, in the buzz group, thank you. And share your differences honestly. Yes.